The locomotive hissed like a great iron beast, its breath a plume of black smoke that stained the impossibly blue New Mexico sky. It was a sky so vast and empty, it seemed to swallow the sun whole, baking the land into a cracked red canvas. For 3 days, Clara Mayfield had stared out at this unforgiving landscape, a world away from the manicured gardens and polite society of Philadelphia. Each clatter of the wheels on the track was a heartbeat of her new, terrifying freedom. She was 19 years old, and she was a runaway. Her fingers, still soft and uncalloused, nervously smoothed the dark wool of her traveling dress. The fabric was too heavy for this blistering heat, a final, suffocating remnant of the life she'd left behind. Beneath the dress, sewn into the lining of her corset, were the last of her mother's jewels and a thin stack of bills, the price of her escape, the price of defying her father and, more terrifyingly, the price of refusing Theodore Blackwood. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. Blackwood, a railroad tycoon whose empire was built on sweat, steel, and the crushed dreams of smaller men. He was twice her father's age, with a moist handshake and eyes that lingered too long, stripping away a woman's dignity piece by piece until she was just another one of his possessions. Her father had called it a magnificent match, a union of old money and new power. Clara had called it a death sentence. She'd seen the way Blackwood looked at her, the proprietary glint in his eyes, and knew that marriage to him would be a cage far smaller and crueler than any her father's house had ever been. So, she had run. In the dead of night, she had slipped out with a single valise, a ghost leaving behind a life of gilded misery. She'd bought a ticket to the furthest point on the map she could afford, a place with a name that sounded like the end of the world, Dusty Creek Station. The train's whistle shrieked, a final, mournful cry as it slowed, the sign for the station, its paint peeled and faded by the relentless sun, swam into view. Dusty Creek, population 212 souls on a good day. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. There was no turning back. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of coal dust, hot metal, and something else, something wild and primal, the smell of the frontier. Stepping down from the carriage was like stepping onto another planet. The platform was a rough collection of weathered planks, and beyond it lay a single, wide street flanked by a dozen or so wooden buildings. A saloon, a general store, a blacksmith's forge belching heat, and a sheriff's office with a Lone Star emblem that looked as tired as the land itself. Dust was everywhere. It coated the buildings, swirled in eddies with every gust of wind, and settled in a fine, gritty layer on her tongue. The few people milling about stopped to stare. A woman like Clara was an apparition here. Her dress, though simple by Philadelphia standards, was an emblem of wealth and softness in a place that valued neither. Her hat, with its modest silk ribbon, might as well have been a crown. She felt their eyes on her, a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and, from the men, a raw, appraising hunger that made her skin crawl. She clutched her valise tighter, her knuckles white. "Well, look what the train dragged in," a voice slurred from the shadows of the station's overhang. 3 men detached themselves from the wall they'd been leaning against. They were unshaven, their clothes stained with sweat and grime, and they moved with a lazy arrogance that set every nerve in Clara's body on edge. The one who had spoken, a burly man with a tangle of greasy hair and tobacco-stained teeth, took a step closer. "Ain't you a pretty little songbird? Far from your nest," he drawled, his eyes roaming over her from the brim of her hat to the tips of her leather boots. His companion snickered, fanning out to block her path. Clara's throat went dry. She tried to step around them, to walk towards the main street, but they shifted to cut her off. "Excuse me, sirs," she said, her voice a reedy whisper she barely recognized. "I'm looking for the hotel." "The hotel," she says. The leader chuckled. spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to her hem. "We got a hotel, but a fine lady like you look like you might prefer some real Western hospitality. My name's Jed." He reached out a grimy hand as if to touch the lace at her collar. Clara flinched back, her heart leaping into her throat. "Please, don't!" "Don't be shy, little bird," another one wheezed, his gaze fixed on the small, jeweled pin on her lapel. "We're just being friendly." Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. This was the reality of her freedom. There was no father, no footman, no protective wall of society to shield her. There was only her and them, and the vast, indifferent wilderness at her back. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her desperate flight had led her from a gilded cage straight into the jaws of a wolf pack. "I believe the lady asked you to leave her be." The voice was low and calm, yet it cut through the tense air like a razor. It held a quiet authority that made all three ruffians freeze. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes searching for the source. He stood just a few feet away, having approached with a silence that was startling. He wasn't a large man, not in the brutish way Jed was, but he possessed a solid, grounded presence. He was dressed in practical, well-worn denim and leather, the clothes of a man who worked the land. A dusty Stetson was pulled low on his brow, shadowing a face that was all sharp angles and sun-weathered lines. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly clear blue, the color of a winter sky, and they were fixed on Jed with an unblinking, unnerving intensity. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw the Colt peacemaker that rested easy on his hip, but a message passed between the men that needed no words. Jed's sneer faltered. He glanced from the stranger to his friends, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He was bigger, and there were three of them. But something about this newcomer's stillness was more menacing than any loud threat. "This ain't your business." "Caldwell," Jed grumbled, though the aggression in his voice had deflated. "A lady in distress in my town is my business," the man named Caldwell replied, his voice still level. He didn't look at Clara, keeping his attention locked on the threat. "Now, you and your boys can either find your way to the saloon, or you can find your way to Sheriff Dalton's jail. Your choice." There was a tense silence. The wind whispered down the street, kicking up dust devils that danced around their feet. Jed stared at Caldwell, his jaw working. Clara could see the internal struggle, the clash of drunken pride against a very sober sense of self-preservation. Finally, with a muttered curse, Jed spat on the ground again. "Come on, boys," he snarled, shoving past his friends. "Ain't worth the trouble." They swaggered off, casting resentful glances over their shoulders, and disappeared into the swinging doors of the saloon. The sudden quiet they left behind was deafening. Clara felt the strength drain from her legs, and she swayed, gripping her valise to keep from falling. Her rescuer finally turned his attention to her. He took a step closer, and she got a better look at him. He was older than her, perhaps 30, with the lines around his eyes that spoke of hardship and a grim set to his mouth that suggested he didn't smile often. There was a weariness about him, a deep-seated gravity that seemed at odds with his quiet strength. He looked like a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked. His voice was softer now, rough around the edges but not unkind. Clara could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He tipped his hat back slightly, revealing a scar that cut a thin, white line through his left eyebrow. "Welcome to Dusty Creek. Not always this eventful." He gestured down the street. "The hotel's that way. Martha's place. She'll see you right." "Thank you," Clara managed to say, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. I don't know what would have happened." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug, as if fending off ruffians was no more troublesome than shooing a fly. Men like that, they prey on those they see as weak. You can't let them see your fear. It was sound advice, she knew, but utterly impossible. Her fear was a living thing, a frantic bird beating its wings against the cage of her ribs. He saw it, of course. Those piercing blue eyes missed nothing. They took in her fine, out-of-place clothes, her pale face, her trembling hands. She saw a flicker of something in their depths, not pity, but a kind of weary recognition. "You're a long way from home, ma'am," he stated. A fact, not a question. "Yes," she whispered, "a very long way." An awkward silence stretched between them. He was a man of few words, and she was a woman whose entire life had been governed by carefully constructed conversations. Here, in this raw, honest place, she had nothing to say. He was a creature of this land, as solid and unyielding as the rock formations that jutted from the desert floor. She was a hothouse flower, transplanted into the desert, and she knew she was already starting to wilt. He seemed to understand. With a final nod, he said, "Best get settled before the sun gets any higher. Martha's a good woman." He began to turn away, and a sudden panic seized Clara. The thought of him walking away, of being left alone again in this hostile town, was unbearable. He was her only anchor in this swirling dust bowl of uncertainty. "Wait." The word escaped her, louder than she intended. He paused, turning back to her, one eyebrow raised in question. "Your name," she said, her cheeks flushing. You said your name was Caldwell." "Ethan Caldwell." He confirmed. "I own the Triple C Ranch, north of here." "I'm Clara Winter." She lied, the false name feeling clumsy on her tongue. It was the first name that had come to mind, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Truly." He held her gaze for a moment longer, and she had the distinct feeling that he could see right through her lie, right through all her defenses, to the terrified girl hiding beneath. But he didn't challenge her. He simply touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell. "Ma'am," he said, and then he turned and walked away, his stride long and purposeful, his figure melting into the shimmering heat of the dusty street. Clara watched him go, a strange mix of relief and a new, more profound loneliness washing over her. Ethan Caldwell. He was the first person in this new life who had shown her a shred of decency, a moment of protection. He was a man of the West, hard and silent, marked by his past, yet possessing a core of honor that shone through like a vein of gold in bare rock. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that their brief encounter on this dusty train platform was not an end, but a beginning. He was a part of this harsh, new world, and she was a runaway with a dangerous secret, and in a town as small as Dusty Creek. She had a feeling their paths were destined to cross again. Martha's hotel was less a hotel and more a sturdy, two-story boarding house that smelled of baking bread and lemon soap. It was an oasis of cleanliness in the sea of dust. Martha herself was a woman built along the same sturdy lines as her establishment, with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun and arms thick with muscle from a lifetime of kneading dough and wringing laundry. She exuded a no-nonsense warmth that Clara found instantly comforting. "Ethan Caldwell brought you to my attention," Martha said, her sharp eyes taking in Clara's exhausted state and the single, fine leather valise. "Said you had a run-in with Jed and his fools. Any woman who can stare down that trash without screaming is welcome under my roof." She named a modest price for a room, and Clara paid for a week in advance, the dwindling of her secret funds a cold knot in her stomach. The room was small and simple, with a lumpy mattress, a wash basin, and a window that looked out over the main street. For the first time in days, Clara was truly alone. She peeled off the heavy wool dress, her body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. She washed the grime from her face and hands, the water in the basin quickly turning a murky brown, as she stared at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. The Philadelphia debutante was gone, replaced by a pale, wide-eyed stranger with a haunted look in her eyes. Clara Mayfield was disappearing, and Clara Winter was being born out of desperation and dust. The next morning, Martha found her in the common room, pushing a piece of toast around her plate. A pretty face won't pay the bills forever. "Child," the older woman said, not unkindly, "you planning on staying in Dusty Creek?" I hope to," Clara replied, the lie tasting less foreign now. "Then you'll need work. Not much for a lady like you. You know how to sew." "A little embroidery, mostly." Martha grunted. "Not much call for embroidered pillowcases out here. Can you cook clean? Are you afraid of hard work?" "No," Clara said, with more conviction than she felt. "I'm not afraid." "Good," Martha said, a hint of approval in her tone. "The Hendersons, out east of town, are looking for help. Mrs. Henderson is a particular woman, but they pay in cash. It's a start." Before Clara could inquire further, the front door opened, letting in a swirl of dust and a man who seemed to fill the entire frame. He wore the same tarnished star she had seen on the building down the street. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and a thick, graying mustache. His eyes, like Ethan Caldwell's, seemed to miss nothing. "Morning, Martha," he said, his voice a low rumble. He removed his hat, revealing a balding pate. His gaze swept the room and landed on Clara. "This the new arrival." "This is Miss Winter," Martha said, her tone becoming slightly protective. "Sheriff Dalton, this is Clara Winter." The sheriff nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on her. "Winter, that's a cool name for a place like this." He walked over to the small counter where Martha kept the guest ledger. "Just arrived on the morning train." "I see." "Yesterday's train," Clara corrected softly. "Of course, yesterday." He didn't look at the ledger. He was looking at her hands, which were resting on the table. Soft, pale hands without a single callus. The hands of a woman who had never worked a day in her life. Traveling alone. Miss Winter. "Yes, Sheriff." "It's a dangerous thing for a woman to do," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes were sharp, especially a woman of your quality. "You running from something." Clara's blood ran cold. I was seeking a new start. My family in the East, they're gone." It was a half-truth, but it felt like a gaping wound. Sheriff Dalton made a noncommittal sound in his throat. "A new start. A lot of folks come west for a new start. The thing about the frontier, though," he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping, "is that it's wide open. Hard to hide, but easy to get lost. Secrets have a way of coming out, like water from a cracked well. They always find their way to the surface." He straightened up and gave Martha a nod. "Just making my rounds. You see Jed or his boys causing any more trouble, you let me know." "Always do, Abe," Martha said. The sheriff placed his hat back on his head and, with one last penetrating look at Clara, he left. The silence he left behind was heavy with unspoken questions. Clara's toast was forgotten, her appetite gone. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind. Secrets have a way of coming out. He knew she was lying. He might not know the truth, but he smelled the deception on her like cheap perfume. The Henderson farm was a testament to the stubbornness of man against the indifference of a nature. It was a patch of struggling corn and a few withered-looking cattle on a swath of land that seemed determined to revert to dust. Mrs. Henderson was a thin, sour-faced woman with the eyes that matched the parched landscape. She looked Clara up and down with open disdain. "Martha says you ain't afraid of work," she said, her voice a reedy whine. "You don't look like you could lift a bucket of water without fainting." "I'm stronger than I look," Clara insisted. She was put to work immediately. The tasks were grueling, mindless, and endless. She beat rugs until her arms felt like lead, scrubbed floors until her knees were raw, and hauled buckets of water from the well until her back screamed in protest. Her soft hands, accustomed to holding teacups and embroidery needles, were raw by noon. By the end of the first day, They were a collection of angry red blisters, some of which had already broken open. She worked alongside two other hired hands, wiry men who spoke little and regarded her with a mixture of pity and contempt. In their eyes, she was an ornament, a creature from another world who was playing at hardship. Mrs. Henderson did nothing to dispel this notion, criticizing her every move, her voice a constant, grating presence. This was the brutal reality of her new life. There was no poetry in this struggle, no romance in the untamed West. There was only the blistering sun, the aching muscles, the biting flies, and the gnawing loneliness. Each night, she would stumble back to Martha's hotel, hand over the pittance she'd earned, and collapse onto her bed, too tired to even weep. She would fall asleep to the distant sound of raucous laughter from the saloon, a reminder of the dangers that lurked just outside her door. A week bled into 2. The blisters on her hands broke, bled, and slowly began to harden into calluses. The sun browned her skin, and the hard labor began to strip away her softness, replacing it with a lean, wiry strength she hadn't known she possessed. She was changing, hardening, becoming a part of the landscape she so feared. One afternoon, she was in the general store, using a small portion of her wages to buy a bar of lye soap. When Sheriff Dalton entered, he nodded to her curtly and went to the counter to speak with the proprietor. As Clara turned to leave, she overheard a fragment of their conversation. "Telegraph from Santa Fe," the sheriff was saying. "Came through this morning. Some big railroad tycoon from back east, a man named Blackwood, is offering a handsome reward for information on his runaway fiancée, a Miss Clara Mayfield of Philadelphia. Seems she vanished with a fair sum of the family jewels." Clara's heart stopped. She froze, her back to them, her hand clutching the bar of soap so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could feel the sheriff's eyes on her back. He was talking for her benefit. It was a test, a warning. She forced her feet to move, to walk out of the store at a normal pace, her head held high. She didn't dare look back. The dusty street seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Blackwood. He wasn't just letting her go. He was hunting her. And he wasn't painting her as a desperate girl fleeing an arranged marriage. He was painting her as a thief, a criminal. It was a clever, cruel move. Now, every lawman, every bounty hunter, every greedy soul in the West would be looking for her. She understood now. She couldn't survive here like this, living day to day, a visible stranger in a small town. The Henderson farm was a dead end. Sheriff Dalton was watching her. It was only a matter of time before her carefully constructed identity as Clara Winter crumbled, to truly disappear. She needed more than a new name. She needed refuge. She needed to be somewhere remote, somewhere shielded from the prying eyes of the law and the long reach of Theodore Blackwood. She needed the protection of the wilderness itself. That evening, as she soaked her aching hands in a bowl of warm water, Martha sat down opposite her. The older woman's face was etched with concern. "Child, that Henderson woman is working you to the bone for pennies," she said gently. "This is no life for you." "It's all I have," Clara said, her voice hollow. "Maybe not," Martha said, leaning forward. "I was just talking to Ethan Caldwell. He was in for supplies." At the mention of his name, Clara's head lifted. She hadn't seen the quiet rancher since that first day, but the memory of his calm strength was a small, steady flame in the darkness of her fear. His housekeeper, an old woman named Elspeth, passed on a few months back. Martha continued. "He's been trying to manage on his own, but the Triple C is a big place. He's got a half-dozen ranch hands to feed. He's looking for a new housekeeper. It's hard work, mind you, but it's a good place. Quiet, remote. Ethan is a fair man, an honorable man." Quiet, remote. The words resonated deep within Clara. The Triple C Ranch. It sounded like a fortress, a world away from telegraphs and sheriffs and the grasping hands of her past. It was a chance, a terrifying, desperate, beautiful chance. A flicker of hope, the first she'd felt in weeks, ignited in her chest. It was a long shot. What would a man like Ethan Caldwell want with a city girl who barely knew how to scrub a floor? He had seen her at her most vulnerable, a fragile creature of the East. Why would he trust her to run his home? But what other choice did she have? The shadows were closing in. Her father's betrayal, Blackwood's relentless pursuit, they were a storm at her back. Ahead of her lay only two paths: capture and a return to her gilded cage, or a desperate gamble on the mercy of a stranger. How would I apply?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. Martha's face broke into a rare, gentle smile. "He's heading back to his ranch at sunup tomorrow. I'll tell him you'll be wanting a word." The decision was made. Clara Mayfield, the heiress, was gone. Clara Winter, the farmhand, was a temporary disguise. Tomorrow, she would walk out to meet the quiet rancher with the winter blue eyes and try to become someone else entirely. She would ask for a job that was her only hope for survival, a step that would lead her deeper into the heart of the unforgiving West and change the course of her life forever. The air was thin and cool before dawn, the sky a deep, star-flecked indigo. Clara met Ethan Caldwell by a supply wagon as the first pale light began to touch the eastern horizon. He stood beside a team of sturdy horses, a silent silhouette against the coming day. He'd acknowledged her presence with a single, sharp nod, his expression unreadable under the shadow of his hat. He took her valise without a word and tossed it into the back of the wagon, then helped her onto the hard wooden seat. The gesture was practical, impersonal, yet the brief touch of his strong hand on her elbow sent a nervous flutter through her. The journey to the Triple C Ranch was a silent one. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the jingle of the harness, and the soft snort of the horses. As the sun climbed, it set the world on fire. The landscape that had seemed menacing from the train window now revealed a stark, breathtaking beauty. Vast plains of golden grass rolled towards a horizon broken by the jagged, purple peaks of distant mountains. The sky was an endless, aching blue, and the sheer scale of it all made Clara feel profoundly small, a tiny speck in an enormous, untamed world. This land didn't care about her fears or her secrets. It was ancient, powerful, and utterly indifferent, and in that indifference, there was a strange kind of peace. It was a place big enough to get lost in. The ranch house appeared as the sun reached its zenith, not rising from the land so much as seeming to be a part of it. It was a long, low building of dark timber and fieldstone, with a wide porch and a roof that had weathered many seasons. It was solid, unpretentious, and enduring. It looked less like a house and more like a fortress against the wilderness. Ethan pulled the team to a halt and finally spoke. "This is it." He led her inside. The main room was vast, dominated by a massive stone fireplace and a long trestle table surrounded by benches, clearly where the hands took their meals. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. It was a man's world, functional and devoid of any soft touches. He turned to face her, his blue eyes finally meeting hers directly. The light from the open door illuminated the fine lines etched around them. "Martha says you're looking for a housekeeper's position." "Yes, Mr. Caldwell." "I need someone who can cook for 7 men, sometimes more. Someone who can keep this place from falling into filth. Someone who isn't afraid of long hours and hard, lonely work." "You are none of those things, Miss Winter." His words were not cruel, just a blunt statement of fact. "You're a lady from the East with soft hands and a secret you're trying to outrun." Clara's heart sank. He saw right through her. The hope that had carried her this far dissolved into cold dread. "I can work," she said, her voice a desperate plea. "I worked for the Hendersons. I'm not afraid. Please, Mr. Caldwell, I just need a chance." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze so intense she felt he was looking directly into her soul, weighing every lie, every truth she held hidden there. She expected him to tell her to leave, to send her back to Dusty Creek and the closing net of her past. "The last woman who ran this house, Elspeth, was here for 30 years, he said, his voice softer now. She was tough as a hickory root and knew every secret this ranch holds. He took a step closer. I don't care what name you use, and I don't care what you're running from. Out here, a person is judged by what they do, not who they were, but I'll give you a warning. His eyes held hers, a silent pact being forged between them. The frontier has its own laws, and the truth will always find its way to the surface. It can't be buried forever. You bring trouble to my ranch, to my men, and you'll answer to me. Is that understood? Tears of sheer, unadulterated relief pricked her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. Understood, Mr. Caldwell. Good, he said, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been the ghost of a smile. The kitchen is through there. The hands will be in for supper at sundown. Don't burn the biscuits. The first few weeks were a trial by fire. Clara rose before the sun and collapsed into her small, Spartan room long after it had set. Her world shrank to the heat of the wood-fired stove, the endless piles of laundry, and the constant battle against the red dust that seeped in through every crack. Cooking for a half-dozen hungry ranch hands was like feeding an army. They were polite enough, removing their hats indoors and offering gruff pleasantries. But they watched her with wary, skeptical eyes. She was an oddity, a canary, as she once overheard a young hand named Jessie call her. Too bright, too fragile for a place like this. But Clara didn't break. She remembered the humiliation of Mrs. Henderson's farm and the cold fear of Sheriff Dalton's words. Failure was not an option. She pored over Elspeth's old, spidery handwritten recipe book, learning the alchemy of turning flour, salt, and lard into passable biscuits. She scrubbed and swept and mended, her movements growing more efficient each day. She didn't complain, didn't make excuses. She simply worked, fueled by a quiet, desperate resolve. Slowly, the men's skepticism began to melt away, replaced by a grudging respect. The old, grizzled horse wrangler, Silas, started leaving a bucket of fresh well water on the porch for her every morning. Jessie, the young hand, began to stammer a thank you, ma'am, after every meal. She wasn't one of them. Not yet, but she was earning her place. Her days were a blur of work, but in the quiet moments, her awareness of Ethan Caldwell was a constant, humming presence. He was a man of deep silences, moving through the ranch with a purpose and economy of motion that spoke of his past as a cavalry officer. He was demanding but fair, with his men and with her. He never offered praise, but she would sometimes catch him watching her, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze before he turned away. One afternoon, he found her staring out at the horse corral, a wistful expression on her face. The horses represented a freedom she craved, the ability to ride out into the vast emptiness and simply disappear. You ever ridden before, he asked, startling her. Only side saddle in a manicured park, she admitted. On a horse so placid it was practically asleep. He considered her for a moment. A person ought to know how to ride out here. It can mean the difference between life and death. Tomorrow, after the morning chores, meet me here. The next day, he was waiting for her with a gentle-eyed buckskin mare named Dusty. The horse was already saddled, not with an elegant side saddle, but with a practical, Western-style stock saddle. You'll ride astride, he stated simply. It's the only way to have real control. Clara looked from the saddle to her skirts and back again, her cheeks flushing. It was unladylike, scandalous even, but she was no longer a lady. She was a housekeeper on a remote New Mexico ranch. With a nod of acceptance, she allowed him to help her. His hands were firm on her waist as he lifted her, and for a dizzying moment, she was pressed against his solid frame. He smelled of leather, dust, and sunshine. The contact was brief, professional, but it left her breathless. His instruction was patient and clear. He taught her how to hold the reins, how to use the pressure of her legs to guide the mare, how to find her balance and move with the horse instead of against it. He walked alongside her, his voice a low, steady rumble at her ear. At first, she was stiff with fear, convinced she would tumble onto the hard-packed earth at any moment. But Ethan's calm confidence was contagious. "Relax," he said. "She can feel your fear. Trust her. Trust yourself." Clara took a deep breath and tried to do as he said. She let the tension drain from her shoulders, allowed her body to sway with the gentle rhythm of the horse's walk. And then, she felt it a connection, a sense of partnership with the powerful animal beneath her. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Ethan saw it. He stopped walking and stepped back, a rare, faint smile touching his own lips in return. "There. Now you've got it." Those lessons became a regular occurrence. They were unspoken appointments in the quiet heat of the afternoon. Under his tutelage, Clara's confidence grew. She graduated from a walk to a trot, and finally, to a canter, riding out across the open range, the wind whipping through her hair. She felt a soaring, exhilarating freedom that was more potent than anything she had ever known. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stepped off the train. She was becoming stronger, more resilient, a frontier woman. During those rides, the wall of silence between them began to crack. He would point out landmarks, name the local flora, and tell her stories of the land, though never of himself. She, in turn, found herself talking about the books she had read, the music she missed. They were small, careful offerings, fragments of two disparate lives finding a common ground under the vast western sky. The stolen glances became longer, the rare smiles more frequent. A fragile, unspoken intimacy was growing between them, as quiet and powerful as the grass pushing its way through the hard, dry earth. But even as this new connection bloomed, the mysteries of the ranch and of its owner remained. There was one door in the main hallway, just past Ethan's office. That was always closed. It was a handsome oak door that, unlike the others, was always locked. One day, driven by curiosity, she asked Silas about it. The old wrangler's amiable expression tightened. "That's the missus's room," he said, his voice dropping. "Mr. Caldwell's mother. No one's been in there since she passed. Best to just leave it be." The closed door became a symbol of the man himself. It represented the past he kept locked away, the source of the deep sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Inside that room, she imagined, lay the heart of Ethan Caldwell, a place of memory and grief. She wondered if he would ever unlock it. For her or for anyone, the ranch had become her sanctuary. But she knew that both it and the man who ran it were haunted by ghosts she had yet to face. The summer monsoon season arrived not with gentle showers, but with the fury of a vengeful god. The sky, which for weeks had been a relentless, pale blue, began to brood. Great bruised purple clouds gathered over the mountains, their bellies heavy with rain. The air grew thick and still, charged with an electric tension that mirrored the disquiet in Clara's own heart. Life at the Triple C had settled into a rhythm that was both comforting and precarious. She had found her place, her purpose, but her secret remained a constant, low-grade fever. Every distant rider, every stranger passing through Dusty Creek, sent a jolt of pure ice through her veins. The name Blackwood was a shadow that stretched all the way from Philadelphia, and she knew, with a certainty that stole her breath, that it was only a matter of time before that shadow fell upon her. The storm broke late one afternoon. It began with a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, a sound more felt than heard. Then came the wind, a sudden, violent gust that slammed against the ranch house, rattling the windows in their frames. The sky opened, and rain fell not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets. Within minutes, the world beyond the porch was a gray, roaring chaos. The ranch hands, caught out on the range, galloped in, their slickers plastered to their bodies, their faces grim. They tended to the horses, secured the livestock, and then huddled in the main room, their usual boisterous energy subdued by the storm's raw power. Clara moved through the house, lighting lanterns against the premature twilight, with every flash of lightning that lit the landscape in a stark, skeletal white. Her nerves stretched tighter. The ensuing clap of thunder was like a physical blow, shaking the very foundations of the house. Storms in the east had been things to be watched from behind thick parlor windows. This was different. This storm felt alive, predatory. It felt like the end of the world. She was checking the latch on a window in the main hallway when a particularly vicious crack of thunder exploded directly overhead. She cried out, stumbling back, her hands flying to her face. A solid presence was suddenly behind her, a firm hand landing on her shoulder to steady her. "It's just noise," Ethan's low voice said, close to her ear. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the flickering lantern light, his face was a mask of shadows and angles, but his eyes were clear and calm. He didn't mock her fear, he simply acknowledged it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm not used to this." "No one ever really gets used to it," he said, his hand still resting on her shoulder. The warmth of his touch seeped through the thin fabric of her dress, a small point of stillness in the raging storm and her own inner turmoil. Another flash of lightning illuminated them, and in that brief, brilliant moment, their eyes met and held, the pretense between them. The carefully maintained distance of employer and housekeeper fell away. He saw not Clara Winter, the capable worker, but the terrified runaway she truly was. And she saw in his eyes not just concern, but a deep, resonant empathy, the look of a man who was no stranger to fear himself. The weight of her secret, of the constant, exhausting vigilance, became too heavy to bear. The storm had stripped away her defenses, leaving her raw and exposed. The words tumbled out of her, a torrent as unstoppable as the rain lashing against the windows. "My name is not Clara Winter," she began, the sound of her own voice alien in the roaring silence between thunderclaps. "It's Clara Mayfield. I'm from Philadelphia, and I am the woman Theodore Blackwood is looking for. I am his runaway fiancé." She said the last words on a ragged breath, expecting him to recoil, for his hand to drop from her shoulder, for his face to harden with anger and betrayal. She had brought the very trouble he had warned her about to his doorstep. But Ethan didn't move. His expression didn't change. His gaze remained steady, and the pressure of his hand on her shoulder perhaps even gentled. He was silent for a long moment. The only sounds, the drumming of the rain and the frantic beating of her own heart. "I know," he said at last, his voice quiet but clear over the storm's din. Her eyes widened. You knew." "I suspected," he corrected. "A woman like you doesn't just appear in a place like Dusty Creek with no past. I read the notice from Santa Fe weeks ago. Mayfield, it fit." Then why she choked out, the question hanging between them. "Why did you let me stay? Why take such a risk?" He finally let his hand fall from her shoulder, but he didn't step away. He looked at her, and the weariness she had first seen in him was there, but it was tempered with something else, something fiercely protective. "Because the first time I saw you, on that train platform, I didn't see a thief or a fiancé," he said. "I saw a woman who was terrified, and alone, and fighting for her life. Blackwood's notice says you belong to him. Your father's arrangement says you belong to him." He took a small step closer, his presence filling the narrow hallway. "But here, on this land, you don't belong to anyone. Here, you are chosen. You chose to be here. I chose to let you stay. That's a different kind of law." The profound simplicity of his words washed over her, a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. He wasn't sending her away. He was sheltering her. He was offering her not just a roof but a principle, the right to choose. As if to seal the moment, another gust of wind hit the house, followed by the sharp crack of splintering wood from further down the hall. They both turned toward the sound. It had come from the locked room, the room that had belonged to his mother. The window latch must have broken, Ethan muttered, a frown creasing his brow. He strode down the hall and stopped before the oak door. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, ornate iron key. For a moment, he just stared at it, as if weighing a decision that had nothing to do with the storm. Then, with a decisive click, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. A gust of wind and rain swirled out to meet them. The room was dark, but a flash of lightning revealed the source of the noise, a large window. Its latch broken, was swinging wildly on its hinges, letting the storm pour in. Ethan moved past her into the room to fight the window, finally managing to wrestle it shut and wedge it with a chair. Clara followed him, her gaze sweeping over the space that had been a mystery for so long. It was a lady's sitting room, frozen in time. The furniture was draped in white dust cloths, creating an eerie, ghostly landscape. Rain had soaked a section of the rug and spattered across the surface of the room's centerpiece, a beautiful rosewood piano. Its lid closed, its wood dulled by a thick layer of dust. "My mother's," Ethan said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. He ran a hand over the dusty surface of the piano, his touch gentle. "She had it shipped all the way from St. Louis. Said a home wasn't a home without music." Clara could almost see her, the ghost of a refined woman trying to carve out a space for beauty in this harsh, unforgiving land. The locked room was not a tomb, it was a shrine. "She played?" Clara asked softly. He nodded, his back still to her. "Every evening. It was the only time I ever saw my father sit still. He'd listen by the fire. It was the only peace this house ever knew." His voice was thick with a memory so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. Over the next few days, as the storm receded, leaving the air washed clean and the earth smelling of rain, the locked room became their project. At Clara's hesitant suggestion, Ethan agreed to let her try and restore the piano. Together, they removed the dust cloths, airing out the room and letting the sunlight stream in for the first time in years. They worked in a comfortable silence, a team united by an unspoken purpose. Clara, using lemon oil and soft rags, carefully polished the rosewood, slowly bringing back its deep, rich luster. Ethan, his large, capable hands surprisingly deft, worked on the internal mechanics, tightening loose wires and replacing a few felt hammers that had been chewed by mice. It was an intimate process. They were not just restoring an instrument. They were gently coaxing a buried history back to life. As Clara worked, she learned more about Ethan than she had in all their riding lessons. He spoke of his mother, a school teacher from Ohio who had followed his father west, a woman of strength and grace who had never quite acclimated to the frontier's brutality, but had filled her home with books and music as a shield against it. In sharing his mother's story, he was sharing a part of himself, the softer, vulnerable part he kept hidden from the world. Finally, the day came when the work was done. The piano gleamed in the afternoon light. Ethan had managed to tune it, his ear surprisingly sharp. "Go on," he said, his voice a low rumble. Clara sat on the bench, her heart fluttering, her hands, now calloused and capable, felt clumsy as they hovered over the ivory keys. She took a breath and began to play. It wasn't a complex piece, just a simple nocturne she had learned as a girl, a melody that was both melancholic and hopeful. The first few notes were hesitant, but they filled the room with a sound that had been absent for too long. The music flowed from her fingers, a pure, clear expression of all the sorrow, fear, and burgeoning hope she held inside. It was a lament for the life she had lost and a hymn for the life she was fighting to build. Ethan stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the vast expanse of the ranch, but she could see the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The music was reaching him, unlocking the grief he had kept so carefully contained in this room. Two damaged souls, a runaway bride and a war-scarred rancher. finding a moment of perfect, poignant harmony in the resurrected notes of a forgotten song. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was profound. He turned slowly, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. He didn't try to hide it. In that moment, he was stripped of his hardened exterior, revealing the wounded man beneath. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and stopped before her. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb stroking the calluses on her palm. It was a gesture of acceptance, of understanding. He was acknowledging her strength, her survival, as if pulled by an invisible string. He leaned down. For a heart-stopping second, she thought he was going to kiss her. The air crackled with the possibility, but he stopped, his face just inches from hers. His gaze dropped to her lips, then lifted back to her eyes. The space between them was filled with everything they couldn't say. The burgeoning love, the shared pain, the danger that still surrounded them. It was all there, a fire beginning to burn, hot and bright, but still carefully, desperately, contained. He was sheltering her from the storm of her past, and in the process, she had found her way into the locked room of his heart. The fragile peace born from the music of the piano settled over the triple C, as gentle and welcome as the cool air that followed the storm. An unspoken understanding now existed between Ethan and Clara. The space between them was no longer filled with the formal distance of employer and employee, but with a palpable, humming tension. A shared glance across the long supper table, the brief touch of his fingers over hers as he handed her a plate. These small moments became charged with a significance that left them both breathless. But the land, having been drenched by the storm, was now treacherous. The dry arroyos and creek beds had become raging, muddy torrents, and the ground was soft and unpredictable. A few head of cattle from the south pasture had been scattered by the storm, and Ethan and his men rode out to gather them before they could wander too far or fall prey to predators. Clara stood on the porch, watching them leave. Ethan, mounted on his powerful black stallion, Zeus, looked back at her just before they rode over the rise. He didn't smile, but he held her gaze for a long moment, a silent promise of his return passing between them. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. It was a new and terrible feeling. Before, her fears had all been for herself. Now, she feared for him. The day wore on, hot and humid. The sun beat down, turning the damp earth to steam. Clara busied herself with chores, trying to keep the anxiety at bay, but her ears were constantly attuned to the sound of hoofbeats. It was late afternoon when she heard them. It wasn't the easy, rhythmic sound of a returning crew. It was frantic, desperate. She ran out onto the porch, her heart seizing in her chest. 4 riders were approaching at a gallop. 2 of them were slumped over a makeshift litter slung between their horses. Silas was leading them, his face a grim, gray mask of stone. "What is it? What's happened?" Clara cried, running to meet them as they clattered into the ranch yard. It was a flash flood in the canyon. Silas rasped, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. The whole damn wall of the arroyo gave way. Mud and rock and water. Young Jesse was trapped. They brought the litter to a halt. Jesse was pale and his leg was clearly broken, a makeshift splint tied around it. But he was conscious. The other figure, however, was terrifyingly still. It was Ethan. His face was ashen, caked with mud and blood that matted his dark hair. A crude bandage was wrapped around his head, already soaked through with red. His clothes were torn, and he wasn't moving. "He got Jesse out," Silas explained, his voice breaking. "Shoved him up the bank, clear of the worst of it. But the current took him, smashed him against the rocks before we could pull him from the water. He hasn't woken up since." Time seemed to stop. The world narrowed to the sight of Ethan's still, broken form. The quiet, indomitable man who had been her protector, her anchor, was now utterly helpless. The strength that had shielded her was gone. "Bring him inside," Clara said, her voice devoid of the hysteria she felt. A strange, cold calm settled over her. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. "Put him in his bed. Jesse, we'll tend to you in the main room. Silas, send someone for the doctor in Dusty Creek. Ride hard." The men, accustomed to taking orders from Ethan, now looked to her. They saw the terror in her eyes, but they also saw a steely resolve they hadn't known she possessed. They did as she commanded, their movements swift and silent. The hours that followed were a waking nightmare, after she had made Jesse as comfortable as possible, giving him laudanum for the pain. Clara's world became the four walls of Ethan's bedroom. She worked with a frantic, focused energy. With the help of a grim-faced Silas, she gently cut away Ethan's torn, muddy clothes. His body, which she had only known as a pillar of strength, was a landscape of bruises. His ribs were clearly broken on one side, his breathing shallow and ragged. The gash on his head was deep, and a fever was already beginning to radiate from his skin. She sent the men away, needing the quiet. Alone, she bathed him, her hands gentle as she cleaned the blood and grime from his body. She saw the old scars that mapped his torso, the faint, puckered marks of old bullets and blades from his time in the war. And now, these new raw wounds, seeing him so vulnerable, so completely at the mercy of his injuries, did not repulse her. It ignited a fierce, protective tenderness within her so powerful it felt like a physical ache in her chest. This man had shielded her from the world. Now, she would shield him from death itself. The doctor was a 2-hour ride away, and 2 hours back. She couldn't just wait. She remembered her mother's remedies, the knowledge passed down from a grandmother who had been a countrywoman. She brewed a strong, bitter tea from willow bark to fight the fever. She cleaned the head wound with whiskey and stitched it closed with a fine needle and silk thread from her sewing kit, her hands surprisingly steady. She wrapped his ribs tightly, praying she was doing it right. Night fell. The house was silent except for the low groans from the main room and the ragged sound of Ethan's breathing. Clara sat in a chair by his bed, a wet cloth in her hand, wiping his brow, his neck, his chest, fighting the fever that threatened to consume him. She did not sleep. She did not eat. She watched, and she waited, and she prayed to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hours before dawn, he began to thrash. His eyes, still closed, moved restlessly beneath their lids. He muttered, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper. At first, the words were nonsensical, fragments of memory from a battle or a cattle drive. She leaned closer, wiping his face, murmuring soft, soothing words. Then his hand, which had been lying limp, shot out and gripped her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, almost painful. His eyes fluttered open, but they were unfocused, glazed with fever. He was looking at her, but seeing something else. "Clara," he rasped, his voice raw. The sound of her name, her real name, from his lips sent a shock through her. "Clara!" "I'm here, Ethan," she whispered, her own voice thick with tears. "I'm right here. Don't let them take you," he mumbled, his brow furrowed in a pained grimace. "Can't lose you, not you." He tried to pull himself up, a look of desperate panic on his face. "Have to protect you." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. In his delirium, in his deepest, most unguarded state, his fear was not for himself, it was for her. The truth of it, the raw, beautiful, terrifying truth of it, broke down the last of her own defenses. The fear of Blackwood, the fear of being discovered, the fear of a future that was anything but certain, it all melted away in the face of this one staggering realization. He loved her, and in that moment, she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she loved him, too. It was not the gentle, polite affection she had been taught to expect. but a fierce, desperate, all-consuming love forged in fear and tempered by respect. She leaned over him, placing her free hand on his cheek. "No one is taking me." "Ethan," she said, her voice firm and clear, willing her strength into him. "I'm not leaving. I'm home." His agitation seemed to subside at her words. His grip on her wrist loosened, and he sank back into the pillows, his breathing still ragged but less frantic. He was lost again to the fever. But Clara had made her decision. She was done running. Her desperate flight for freedom had led her here, to this man's side. She would no longer be a fugitive, hiding in the shadows. She would stand with him, fight with him, and whatever future they could carve out of this harsh land, they would face it together. The doctor arrived shortly after sunrise, a portly, weary man who confirmed Clara's fears: broken ribs, a severe concussion, a dangerous fever. But he also looked at her with surprise and approval. "You stitched this wound?" he asked, examining her handiwork, clean as a whistle, and the willow bark was the right call. "You may have saved his life, young lady." For 2 more days, the fever raged. Clara never left his side. Then, on the 3rd morning, she awoke in the chair to find him looking at her. His eyes were clear. "Clara," he said, his voice weak but his own. Tears streamed down her face as she smiled. "Ethan." His recovery was slow, but steady. As his strength returned, so did the profound, unspoken thing that had grown between them. One evening, a week later, he was sitting up in bed, propped against a mound of pillows. Clara sat in the chair beside him, mending one of his shirts. "Clara," he said, his voice serious, "marry me." She looked up, her needle pausing mid-stitch. It wasn't a question born of romance, but of raw, undeniable necessity. It was a declaration, a claim, a promise of protection made legal and binding. "We don't know what's coming," he continued, his gaze intense. "But if Blackwood's men show up, I want you to have my name. I want you to be my wife. I want the world to know you are not some runaway piece of property. You are the mistress of the Triple C. You are Mrs. Caldwell." She put the shirt aside and went to him. Taking his hand in hers, his skin was still warm, but it was the warmth of life, not fever. "Yes, Ethan," she whispered. "Yes." They were married 2 weeks later. The traveling preacher, a thin, earnest man named Reverend Johnson, made a special trip out from Dusty Creek. The ceremony was held in the main room, in front of the great stone fireplace. Clara wore her best dress, a simple blue calico she had sewn herself. Ethan, still leaning heavily on a cane, stood tall and proud beside her. The ranch hands were their witnesses, their weathered faces scrubbed clean, their expressions a mixture of awe and genuine happiness for their boss. There was no music, no flowers, no feast. There were only the simple, solemn words of the vows, spoken in the heart of the home they had built together, when the preacher declared them man and wife. Ethan turned to her. He didn't kiss her with passion, but with a deep, reverent tenderness that sealed the promise they had just made. That night, in his room, which was now their room, a wave of nervous apprehension washed over Clara. This was her wedding night. She was a wife. She looked at Ethan, who was watching her from the bed, his expression gentle. He was her husband, the man she loved with every fiber of her being. But the ghosts of her past were not so easily banished. She had been raised to be a prize, an object for barter. Her value was in her name, her breeding, and her untouched state. Theodore Blackwood had looked at her like a horse he was about to purchase, appraising her lines, her potential. Now, faced with the reality of true intimacy, a deep-seated insecurity surfaced. She was so small, her frame slight. She felt fragile, inadequate. She was afraid that she would be a disappointment to this strong, capable man. What did she know of pleasing a husband? She was a virgin bride. given away once and now chosen. But the fear of being found lacking lingered. Sensing her hesitation, Ethan held out his hand. "Clara, come here." She went to him, and he gently pulled her down to sit on the edge of the bed. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, and he saw it all: the fear, the uncertainty, the shadow of the woman she had been raised to be. "You're trembling," he whispered. She couldn't meet his gaze. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice barely audible. I'm not what you might expect. I'm so small, inexperienced." A soft, low chuckle rumbled in his chest. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. The love in his eyes was so profound, so absolute, it stole her breath. "Clara," he said, his voice a soft, steady anchor in the storm of her doubt. He leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture of pure devotion. Then he looked into her eyes again. "You are everything I never knew I needed. You faced down ruffians, nursed me back from the dead, and tamed this wild, lonely house. You are the strongest person I know." He drew her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her ear. He held her like she was something infinitely precious. He buried his face in her hair and whispered the words that would forever banish the ghost of Theodore Blackwood. The words that would redefine her not as property, but as a cherished, chosen woman. "You're perfect." The weeks following their wedding were a quiet, sun-drenched idyll, a stolen moment of peace in a life that had been defined by turmoil. Ethan's strength returned day by day. The cane was soon discarded, and though a slight limp remained when he was tired, he once again moved with the quiet authority of a man who was master of his domain. But something in him had softened. The deep-seated weariness in his eyes was replaced by a gentle warmth, especially when he looked at Clara. For her part, Clara blossomed. Love, she discovered, was not a gilded cage but a vast, open prairie. It was the freedom to be herself, the safety to lay down the heavy burden of her fear. The Triple C was no longer just a refuge. It was her home. The rhythms of the ranch were the rhythms of her own heart. She knew the names of all the horses, the moods of all the men, and the precise moment when the setting sun would turn the distant mountains a deep, bruised purple. She was no longer Clara Mayfield, the runaway heiress, nor Clara Winter, the desperate housekeeper. She was Clara Caldwell, and the name felt as comfortable and right as the calloused skin on her hands. They built a life in the small moments, in the shared silence of the evenings, when he would sit by the fire cleaning his rifle and she would be mending. Their quiet companionship filled the large room more completely than any conversation. In the mornings, when he would rise before dawn, he would press a kiss to her sleeping forehead, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. She had fled a world of calculated transactions and found one of pure, unvarnished truth. It was this peace, this profound sense of rightness, that made the arrival of the riders so jarring. It was mid-afternoon. Clara was on the porch, shaking out a tablecloth. When she saw the dust cloud on the horizon, it wasn't the familiar plume of the ranch hands returning. This was different, slower, more deliberate. As the figures grew closer, a cold dread, a familiar ghost from her past, began to creep up her spine. There were 4 of them. They were not cowboys. The man in the lead wore a dark, tailored suit, absurdly out of place in the blistering New Mexico heat. His face was pale and clean-shaven, and he sat atop his horse with a rigid, uncomfortable posture. He looked like a crow that had wandered into a flock of eagles. The 3 men who flanked him were another matter entirely. They were hard-faced and grim, their clothes dusty but well-made, and they wore their holstered pistols not as tools of the trade, like Ethan's men, but as statements of intent. They were hired guns. The men in the yard stopped what they were doing. Silas, who had been oiling a saddle, slowly put his rag down. Jesse, mucking out a stall, froze, his pitchfork held like a weapon. A tense, unnatural silence fell over the ranch. Clara's hand flew to her throat, the tablecloth forgotten on the ground. She knew, with a soul-deep certainty, who they were. The past had finally caught up with her. The man in the suit guided his horse to a stop in front of the porch and dismounted with practiced ease, though he was clearly no horseman. He removed his hat, revealing slick, dark hair, and dabbed at his brow with a silk handkerchief. His eyes, small and intelligent, like a rat's, swept over the ranch yard, taking in the silent, hostile figures of the ranch hands before finally settling on Clara. A thin, condescending smile touched his lips. "A rustic paradise," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, yet carrying an undertone of mockery. One can almost see the appeal. "I am Charles Harrington. I am an attorney, representing the interests of Mr. Theodore Blackwood. I believe you have something, or rather, someone who belongs to him." Just then, the screen door creaked open. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, moving to stand slightly in front of Clara. He was no longer leaning, but his weight was settled on his good leg, his body poised with a dangerous stillness. He didn't look at Harrington's men. His piercing blue eyes were locked on the lawyer. "You've got a long way to ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of." "Mister," Ethan said, his voice a low, deadly calm, "I suggest you get started." Harrington's smile didn't falter. "Ah, you must be Mr. Caldwell, the proprietor, I assure you. I have no desire to be here a moment longer than necessary. My business is with this woman." He gestured dismissively towards Clara. "Miss Clara Mayfield." "Her name is Mrs. Caldwell," Ethan corrected, his voice as hard as granite, "and whatever business you think you have with her is finished." "On the contrary," Harrington said, turning to one of his men, who dismounted and unstrapped a leather satchel from his horse. "It is just beginning." He took the satchel, opened it, and produced a thick roll of parchment tied with a blue ribbon. "This, Mr. Caldwell, is a legally binding contract of betrothal, signed by Miss Mayfield's father, a man of considerable standing, and by my client, Mr. Theodore Blackwood. It guarantees her hand in marriage, a marriage that was to take place 2 months ago." He unrolled the document with a flourish. Clara could see her father's elegant, flowing signature at the bottom. The sight of it felt like a betrayal all over again. "This document makes her Mr. Blackwood's promised bride," Harrington continued, his voice rising, projecting for all the silent, watching men to hear. Her flight was not only a breach of this sacred contract, but it was also accompanied by a criminal act. She absconded with a collection of family jewels valued at over $20,000. A formal complaint of theft has been filed. He let the accusation hang in the hot, still air. It was a masterful, cruel stroke. He was painting her not as a desperate woman, but as a common criminal, a duplicitous thief who had manipulated this simple rancher. Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "That's a damn lie." Harrington ignored him, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "So, you see, Mr. Caldwell, this is not a simple frontier dispute. This is a matter of law, of property. I am here, with duly authorized agents, to escort Miss Mayfield back to Philadelphia to face her obligations and her crimes. I would advise you not to interfere." The 3 hired guns shifted, their hands drifting down to rest on the butts of their pistols. The silent threat was unmistakable. The men in the yard tensed, their own hands making the same subtle, dangerous journey. The air grew thick, electric, the seconds stretching out into an eternity. One wrong word, one sudden move, and the yard would erupt in a storm of gunfire. Ethan took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving to the edge of the porch so that he was looking down at the lawyer. The last traces of his injury were gone, replaced by the unyielding strength of a man defending his home. "That might be paper law back east, Mr. Harrington," Ethan said, his voice dangerously soft. "You city folks seem to put a lot of stock in signatures and contracts. Out here, we put our stock in a person's character. We believe in a man's honor and a woman's word." He looked from Harrington to Clara, and his expression softened for a fraction of a second, a silent reassurance that she was not alone. Then his eyes, now as cold and hard as blue ice, snapped back to the lawyer. "I don't know any Clara Mayfield," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "I know Clara Caldwell, the woman who stood right here, in this house, and took vows before God and man. She is my wife, and here in New Mexico, that's the only contract that matters." He let his gaze sweep over the three gunmen, a silent challenge. "And in the West, Mr. Harrington, we protect what's ours." The declaration was a gauntlet thrown down. It was a rejection of Harrington's world, of Blackwood's power, and an affirmation of the simple, brutal code of the frontier. Harrington's composure finally cracked. A flush of angry red crept up his neck. "This is madness. You are harboring a fugitive. A thief. She has fooled you. You ignorant rancher." Before Ethan could respond, Clara moved. She stepped out from behind his protective shadow, her head held high, her back straight. The terrified girl who had stumbled off the train was gone forever. In her place stood a woman forged in hardship and strengthened by love. She walked to the edge of the porch, her gaze level with Harrington's, and her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady, carrying across the silent yard. "That signature on your contract belongs to my father. Mr. Harrington," she said, her tone icy. "It was his transaction. I was not a party to the agreement. I was the merchandise being sold, a bargain he made to settle his debts." She took another step, her eyes flashing with a fire Harrington had not expected. "And the jewels you speak of were not stolen. They were a final gift from my mother, left to me in her will. They were my only inheritance, my only means of escaping a life of servitude to a man I despised. They were mine to take." She looked past the lawyer, at the hard-faced men who had come to drag her back to her cage. She looked at the loyal, determined faces of Silas and Jesse and the other hands who were ready to risk their lives for her. And then she looked back at Harrington and delivered the final, liberating truth. "You speak of property, sir," she said, her voice ringing with the force of her conviction. "But you are mistaken. I am not property. I am a free woman, and I am home." Her defiance stunned Harrington into silence. He had expected tears, hysterics, a fainting spell. He had not expected this frontier queen with calloused hands and a spine of steel. He saw the admiration in the eyes of the ranch hands. He saw the unshakable devotion in Ethan Caldwell's face. He saw that he had not come to reclaim a frightened girl, but to wage war against a united and determined family. His smooth, legalistic world was colliding with a wall of pure, primal loyalty. His hired guns, for all their menace, were now looking uncertain. They were paid to intimidate, not to start a small war against a half-dozen determined men on their own ground. The odds had shifted. Harrington, a man who survived on calculation, quickly reassessed the situation. He could not win this today. Not like this. He took a step back, his face a mask of controlled fury. He carefully rolled the parchment and slid it back into its leather case. "This changes nothing," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "The law is the law, even in this God-forsaken wasteland. Mr. Blackwood is a man of immense power and infinite resources. He will not be denied what is rightfully his." He turned his venomous gaze on Ethan. "You have made a powerful enemy today. Caldwell, you and your wife, you may have won this skirmish, but I assure you, the war is coming. We will be back." With that, he turned, mounted his horse with a clumsy, angry heave, and, without a backward glance, spurred his horse out of the yard. His three men hesitated for a moment, their eyes lingering on the silent, armed men of the Triple C before turning to follow their employer. They rode away. leaving a thick cloud of dust to settle in the tense, quiet air. The immediate danger had passed, but Harrington's threat hung over the ranch like the promise of a coming storm. Ethan turned to Clara. He didn't speak. He simply opened his arms, and she went into them, burying her face in his chest. He held her tightly, his hand stroking her hair. She wasn't trembling. She felt a profound, exhilarating calm. She had faced her past, spoken her truth, and she had not been alone. She was surrounded by the fierce, protective loyalty of the man she loved and the community that had become her family. The battle was not over. But for the first time, Clara Caldwell believed, with all her heart, that it was a battle she could win. Charles Harrington's threat was not an idle one. It was a promise, and it poisoned the peace of the Triple C. The days that followed were not filled with fear, but with a grim, focused preparation. The ranch transformed from a home into a fortress. Ethan, Silas, and the men worked with a silent, synchronized purpose that spoke of shared battles in their pasts. They boarded up the larger windows, leaving only narrow slits for rifles. They hauled barrels of water and sacks of flour and ammunition into the main house. The ranch yard was cleared. Every potential piece of cover for an attacker removed or reinforced for their own use. A war was coming, and the men of the Triple C would meet it on their feet. Clara was no longer a bystander. The domestic sphere of the kitchen and the laundry room expanded to include the entire ranch. She was the quartermaster of their small army, ensuring every man had what he needed. She tore sheets for bandages, her hands moving with a steady, practiced rhythm. She melted lead and helped cast new bullets over the fire, the acrid smell of the molten metal a stark reminder of the violence to come. One afternoon, she found Ethan in the barn, meticulously cleaning his Winchester rifle. The setting sun cast long shadows through the open doors. "I want you to teach me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He looked up, his hands pausing in their work. He saw the resolve in her eyes, the steel that had replaced the fear. He didn't argue or try to protect her by sending her away. He understood that this was her fight as much as his. To deny her a part in it would be to deny the very freedom they were fighting for. He nodded slowly. "All right." He started her with a pistol, its weight unfamiliar and heavy in her hand. He showed her how to stand, how to aim, how to control her breathing. Then he moved her to a rifle, the weapon that would be more useful from the windows of the house. The kick of it against her shoulder was a brutal shock, but she didn't flinch. She fired again and again, learning to compensate, to find her target. She was not a natural shot, but she was determined. She was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a defender, ready to protect her home. The waiting was the hardest part. The sun rose and set on a world holding its breath. Every dust devil on the horizon, every cry of a distant hawk, sent a jolt of adrenaline through the tense quiet. They were an island of defiance in a vast, empty land, waiting for the tide to roll in. It came on the fourth day. A lone rider appeared first, a scout who stopped on the rise overlooking the ranch, a dark silhouette against the morning sky. He watched them for a long time before turning and disappearing. An hour later, the army arrived. There were at least 20 of them, a private militia of hired guns, moving with the disciplined order of a cavalry unit. They were well armed and well mounted, a stark contrast to the small, determined group of ranchers they had come to destroy. At their head rode 2 men. One was the lawyer, Charles Harrington, his face a smug, triumphant sneer. The other was a large, imposing figure in a fine broadcloth coat, a man whose face Clara had only ever seen in her nightmares. Theodore Blackwood. He was just as she remembered, only more menacing under the harsh western sun. His face was fleshy and pale, his eyes small and cold, devoid of anything but a chilling, possessive arrogance. He surveyed the fortified ranch house not as a man entering a battle, but as a landlord inspecting a property that had fallen into disrepair. He had not come to negotiate. He had come to collect. The riders fanned out, surrounding the ranch yard, their rifles held ready. Blackwood and Harrington rode forward, stopping just out of pistol range. Clara Blackwood's voice boomed across the yard, a sound that was both deeply familiar and utterly alien in this place. It was the voice of her gilded cage, and it had no place here. This foolish game is over. You have caused me a great deal of trouble and expense. Come out now, and I will be lenient. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his Winchester held loosely in one hand. Clara was right behind him, a rifle of her own clutched in her hands. The men of the CCC were at the windows, their own rifles poking through the narrow slits. Blackwood. Ethan's voice was calm, almost conversational, yet it carried across the yard with deadly clarity. You have no authority here. This is my land. That is my wife. Turn around and ride away. Blackwood let out a short, barking laugh. He looked at Ethan with utter contempt, as if he were an insect to be crushed under his heel. Your wife. Do you have any idea who I am? I build railroads. I own politicians. I own everything. That woman is a flighty, ungrateful child who made a bargain. She is my property, and I have come to claim what is mine. He turned his cold eyes on Clara. Did you really think you could hide from me in this hovel? Did you think this farmer could protect you? You belong to me. Clara, you always have. It was then that Clara stepped forward, moving to stand beside Ethan, her rifle held steady. She looked directly at the man who had haunted her dreams, the man who represented everything she had fled, and she felt not a flicker of fear, only a cold, clarifying rage. I belong to no one but myself, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she never knew she possessed. Blackwood's face purpled with fury. The rejection, the public defiance from what he considered a mere possession, was an insult he could not tolerate. His last shred of civility vanished. So be it, he snarled, turning to his men. The woman is to be taken alive. The rest of them are trespassing. Burn it all to the ground. He raised his hand to give the signal, but before he could drop it, a shot rang out. Not from the house, but from the hayloft of the barn. One of Blackwood's men cried out and tumbled from his saddle. It was Silas, the old wrangler, who had slipped out during the tense parley. The world exploded. The ranch yard became a maelstrom of smoke, noise, and chaos. The sharp crack of rifles and the deeper boom of shotguns echoed off the mountains. Wood splintered from the porch railings and the walls of the house as bullets rained down on them. Blackwood's men, confident in their superior numbers, charged forward, using the horse trough and the corral fence for cover. Inside, Clara and the others worked as a team. The house was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Ethan stood at the main window, firing with a calm, deadly efficiency. His shots measured, his movements economical. Jesse, the west window. Don't let them flank the porch, he yelled over the din. Clara took her position at a side window, her heart pounding but her hands steady. She saw a man trying to creep along the side of the house, and without a second thought, she lifted her rifle, aimed as Ethan had taught her, and fired. The man grunted and scrambled back behind a water barrel, clutching his shoulder. A wave of nausea and triumph washed over her. She had fired a shot in defense of her home. She was a part of this fight. The battle raged, a brutal, ugly ballet of violence. One of Blackwood's men managed to get a torch lit and made a run for the house, but a shot from Jesse's rifle sent him sprawling into the dust, the torch sputtering out beside him. They were outnumbered, but they were defending their home. They knew every angle, every inch of cover. They fought with the ferocity of men who had everything to lose. Blackwood's men were fighting for pay. They had not signed up for this kind of stiff resistance. They had expected to sweep in and crush a few simple ranchers. Instead, they had run into a hornet's nest. Their initial charge faltered. A few men went down, and the others grew hesitant, their will to fight eroding with every shot fired from the determined fortress. Clara lost track of time. Her world narrowed to the small rectangle of her window. The weight of the rifle, the kick against her shoulder, the desperate need to protect the man she loved and the life they had built. She moved through the house, reloading rifles for Ethan and the others, her fear burned away by the adrenaline of the fight. The turning point came when Blackwood, enraged by his men's failure, decided to lead a charge himself. He was not a fighter. He was a man who paid others to fight for him. But his monumental arrogance could not accept defeat. With a roar of fury, he spurred his horse forward, firing his pistol wildly at the house. Ethan saw him coming. He raised his Winchester, taking careful aim. But just as he was about to squeeze the trigger, a bullet from one of Blackwood's men struck the window frame next to him, sending a spray of splintered wood into his face. He staggered back, momentarily blinded. His shot going wide, Blackwood was almost to the porch, a triumphant, demonic grin on his face. He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at the spot where Ethan had been standing. But he hadn't seen Clara. She was at the main door, which had been blasted off its hinges. She saw Ethan fall back. She saw Blackwood's triumphant face. His pistol aimed to kill. There was no time to think. She lifted her own rifle, the one Ethan had taught her to use. It was heavy, and her arms trembled with exhaustion. But her aim was true. She fired. The shot was not a fatal one. It struck Blackwood in the shoulder, the impact spinning him halfway around in his saddle and causing his own shot to go wild. Burying itself in the roof of the porch, he cried out in a mixture of pain and shocked outrage. That one moment was all Ethan needed. He cleared his eyes, his vision blurring, and saw Blackwood, wounded and exposed. At the same instant, a shot from Silas in the hayloft took down the man riding beside Blackwood. The railroad tycoon was alone, a perfect target. Ethan's Winchester cracked. The bullet struck Blackwood square in the chest. The force of it threw him from his horse. He landed in the dusty yard with a heavy, final thud. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. The great man, the titan of industry, lay broken and bleeding in the dirt. The fight went out of his hired guns. Seeing their paymaster fall, they broke and fled, Harrington scrambling to get away with them, a panicked rat deserting a sinking ship. The silence that descended was more profound than the noise it replaced. It was the silence of victory, paid for in blood and gunpowder. Ethan stumbled out onto the porch, his face bleeding from a dozen small cuts, and pulled Clara into his arms. The men emerged from the house, from the barn, their faces grimed with smoke, their knuckles white on their rifles. They were all alive. Clara gently pulled away from Ethan's embrace. She walked down the porch steps and across the yard, her rifle still in her hand. She stopped a few feet from where Theodore Blackwood lay dying. He stared up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and hatred. Blood bubbled on his lips. "You," he rasped. "The word a curse. You were mine." Clara looked down at the man who had been the architect of all her fear. He was no longer a monster, a titan of immense power. He was just a man, bleeding his life away in the dust. The last of her fear died with him. She stood over him, the embodiment of the freedom she had fought and bled for. And she gave him her final answer, her voice clear and ringing in the quiet yard. A declaration for him and for the entire world to hear. "I am not property," she said. "I am free." The silence that followed the retreat of Blackwood's men was heavier and more profound than the battle itself. It was a silence filled with the smell of spent gunpowder, the low groans of the wounded, and the sight of the carnage that had desecrated their home. The great monolithic power of Theodore Blackwood had ended not with a thunderclap, but with a pathetic whimper in the New Mexico dust. The cost of their victory was etched into the landscape. A small fire, started by a stray torch, was consuming the corner of the main barn, sending a plume of greasy black smoke into the pristine blue sky. The porch of the house was riddled with bullet holes. its railings shattered. The bodies of Blackwood and 3 of his men lay where they had fallen, stark and terrible reminders of the price of freedom. There was no celebration. Ethan, his face a mask of grim exhaustion, moved among his men, clapping a shoulder here, checking a wound there. Jesse had a nasty gash on his arm, and Silas had taken a bullet that had grazed his ribs. But by some miracle, they were all alive. They were a battered, bruised, but unbroken family. Clara, her rifle finally set aside, moved with a purpose that belied the tremor in her hands. She tore more strips from the precious few sheets she had left, her mind a cold, clear space of immediate needs. Water, bandages, whiskey for cleaning wounds. She was no longer thinking of Philadelphia or the life she had left behind. Her world had shrunk to this patch of embattled land and the lives of the men who had bled for it. As they were dousing the last of the flames on the barn, a new dust cloud appeared on the horizon. For a heart-stopping moment, they thought Blackwood's men were returning. Rifles were raised again, weary bodies tensing for another fight. But as the riders drew closer, they saw the familiar figure of Sheriff Dalton at their head, followed by a dozen armed men from Dusty Creek. The sheriff pulled his horse to a halt, his gaze sweeping over the scene, the bodies, the smoldering barn, the fortified house. He looked at Ethan, then at Clara, and finally at the dead tycoon lying in the center of the yard. His weathered face was impossible to read. "Heard a bit of a ruckus out this way," Dalton said, his voice a dry understatement. He dismounted and walked over to Blackwood's body, nudging it with the toe of his boot. Theodore Blackwood. "Well, looks like his business in New Mexico is concluded." He looked up at Ethan, a hard question in his eyes. "You want to tell me what happened here?" "Caldwell." Ethan didn't flinch. "He came to claim my wife as his property. He brought an army to back his claim. We disagreed." Dalton was silent for a long moment. He looked at the bullet holes that peppered the front of the house, a clear indication of who had fired first and with the most aggression. He looked at the determined, soot-stained faces of the Triple C men, and he looked at Clara, standing beside her husband, her chin held high, a woman who looked nothing like the frightened girl he had first seen at the hotel. "Property," Dalton repeated, the word tasting like something sour in his mouth. He looked back at Blackwood's corpse. "Some men think a piece of paper gives them the right to own another person's soul. The law can get complicated back east. Out here," he straightened up, his decision made, "it's a little simpler. You defend your home. You defend your wife. The law calls that self-defense. As for these others," he gestured to the dead gunmen, "looks to me like they died of acute lead poisoning. Case closed." It was a declaration of allegiance. In that moment, Sheriff Dalton was not just an officer of the law. He was a man of the West, siding with his own. He was choosing the unwritten code of the frontier over the corrupted laws of a distant world. The men from Dusty Creek dismounted, and the grim work of cleaning up began. But it was not just work. It was a communal act of healing. Martha arrived in a buckboard wagon, her face a mask of worry. The wagon bed filled with medical supplies, bread, and a keg of water. The blacksmith, the general store owner, men Clara had only ever seen in passing, they all came. They helped bury the dead in a quiet corner of the ranch, their graves unmarked. They helped patch the holes in the ranch house walls and started the long, arduous work of rebuilding the burned section of the barn. Clara, moving through the crowd with a pot of coffee, finally understood. Her family was not just Ethan. It was this entire, sprawling, stubborn community. They were bound together not by blood, but by a shared understanding of what it took to survive in this beautiful, brutal land. They were a people who knew the value of a good neighbor, because they knew that out here, a neighbor was often the only thing standing between you and a lonely death. The rebuilding took weeks. The sound of hammers replaced the sound of gunfire. Laughter, rough and heartfelt, slowly returned to the ranch yard. Ethan, working alongside his men, seemed to shed the last of the shadows that had haunted him since the war. He was not just a survivor anymore. He was a builder, the leader of a family, the center of a community. He had found a new reason to fight, and a new reason to live. Clara's transformation was complete. She worked from sunup to sundown, her hands as rough and capable as any man's. She could ride, shoot, and manage the complex logistics of a working ranch. The memory of the fragile Philadelphia debutante was like a story about someone else, a ghost from a distant life. She had been forged anew in the crucible of the frontier, and she had emerged stronger than she ever thought possible. One evening, as the last of the light bled from the sky, she stood with Ethan on the newly repaired porch, looking out at the land that was now, unequivocally, her home. He slipped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "It's over," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "He can't ever touch you again." She leaned her head against his shoulder, a profound sense of peace settling over her. But there was one last secret she had been keeping, one last piece of their new life that had yet to be revealed. She had suspected it for weeks. During the tense days of waiting and the frantic aftermath of the fight, the exhaustion she felt wasn't just from the work. It was something deeper. She took his hand and placed it on her flat stomach. "It's not over, Ethan," she whispered. "It's just beginning." He went still. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, his eyes wide with a dawning, incredulous joy that was more moving than any smile. He saw the truth in her serene expression. A new life, a new generation, conceived not in a cold, contractual union, but in a love that had weathered storms and survived a war. A child of the Triple C, a child of the West. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply pulled her into his arms and held her, his embrace filled with a fierce, protective tenderness that spoke more than words ever could. This was the ultimate victory, the final, definitive proof that life and love would always triumph over the forces of possession and destruction. Months passed. The raw scars on the ranch healed, fading into the landscape. The rhythm of the seasons returned, timeless and reassuring. Winter gave way to spring, and the plains erupted in a riot of wildflowers. One morning, just before dawn, Clara awoke. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Ethan, and went to the window. The first pale light was touching the eastern sky, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold. She wrapped her arms around her swelling belly, feeling the gentle flutter of the new life within her. A pair of strong arms slipped around her from behind, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of her husband's chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his own hands coming to rest over hers on her belly. They stood in silence, watching the day being born. The sun broke over the distant purple mountains, flooding the plains with a clean, golden light. It touched the roof of their rebuilt barn, the sturdy fences of the corral, the graves of the men who had died, and the walls of the house that had been their fortress and was now their sanctuary. It was a new day, a new beginning. Ethan leaned in, his lips brushing against her ear. His voice was a soft, steady whisper, a final, perfect promise that sealed her long and arduous journey. "No more running," he said. "You're home now." Thank you for listening to this story from Wild West Night. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Night. Give this video a like, and consider supporting us further by hitting the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.